Since China opened its doors to the rest of the world, following Mao Zedong's death, its economy took off like a rocket. The Asian giant created special economic zones with fewer taxes and regulations, attracting waves of foreign investment, and soon became the world's manufacturing powerhouse. But what if I told you that's not entirely true? You see, in the early 2000s, while GDP was growing above 10% annually, the income of the poorest segment of the population was actually falling. We're talking about around 130 million Chinese people who, instead of riding the wave of economic growth, saw their income decline by 2.5% each year. And you might wonder, how on earth was that possible? Didn't the Chinese miracle lift millions of people out of poverty? Take a look at this map. Western China is by far a highly marginalized region, much poorer than the coastal eastern areas. In some ways, it's as if China's economy were split in two. However, it wasn't always like this. The economic model China was heading toward in the 1980s was very different from what it eventually became. In other words, at a certain point in history, China decided to condemn its rural areas to poverty in order to boost urban zones. The reason for this shift? None other than the Tiananmen Square protests. In 1989, tens of thousands of Chinese people gathered in Tiananmen Square, in front of the Forbidden City, from where emperors had ruled for centuries, to demand more democracy and freedom. The government, however, responded with martial law, sent tanks into the streets, and killed thousands of people. From that time, the famous image of one person standing in front of the tanks has endured. For many analysts, Tiananmen was merely a pause in the government's openness agenda. But in reality, its long-term consequences have been huge. It was one of the most pivotal moments in China's history that changed its future forever and largely explains the significant economic divide between the two Chinas. So, what exactly happened? Why did the Chinese government decide to condemn such a large part of the country? To understand the significant wealth gap between rural China and coastal China, we need to go back to the origins of this story. After Mao's death in 1976, Hua Guofeng succeeded him as leader of the Chinese Communist Party. But in practice, Mao's true successor was one of the central figures of today's story, Deng Xiaoping, who soon formally took power. Deng Xiaoping wasn't alone. He had two key allies, Zhao Ziyang and Hu Yaobang. These three were the primary architects of the Chinese miracle, but their reforms didn't start in the big cities. They began in the countryside. They privatized huge parcels of land, gave farmers the freedom to trade, and most importantly, to start new businesses. Thanks to these reforms, within less than a decade, the number of people living in poverty dropped from 250 million to 96 million. A total of 150 million people lifted out of poverty. And here lies the key point of this video. The true engine of China's economy was neither foreign investment nor the futuristic megastructures so often featured in Chinese Communist Party propaganda. It was the rural reforms. Let's take a closer look at the data. With the reforms, rural business income rose from 8.1% in 1983 to 14.9% in 1988. Farmers began setting up small and medium-sized enterprises of all kinds. For example, they could travel to cities to sell crafts or repair simple machines like refrigerators. In fact, these rural entrepreneurs who commuted to cities daily represented 30% of urban business activity. Moreover, these rural enterprises were much more efficient than urban ones. Why? The reason is that the new reforms focused so heavily on the rural areas that these regions advanced much faster than the urban centers. In this way, rural areas experienced a regulatory and economic boom. To give you an idea, rural companies operating in cities averaged 22 employees compared to 17 in urban companies. They also had more investors, 2.4 versus 1.8, and even raised more initial capital despite coming from much poorer backgrounds. It wasn't just rural companies selling products in the cities that succeeded. On the contrary, rural companies operating locally were even larger, with an average of 35 employees in 1985. So, where did all the money come from to fund these rural ventures? The answer is a massive increase in credit. Under Mao's China, starting private businesses was forbidden, and the state controlled the banking sector to fund public enterprises it deemed suitable. This meant that if someone wanted to break the law to start their own business, it was much more challenging. In other words, to start a business, you need money, but the banks in communist China logically did not finance private businesses. The solution? Private credit. Suddenly, many small lenders and independent investors began to emerge. The loans they provided increased 65 times between 1979 and 1982. Over time, these small rural enterprises grew into genuine giants with tens of thousands of employees. To give you an idea, thanks to the rise of private credit, the income earned by private businesses, many from rural areas, had grown by 30%, while the salaries of workers, typical of urban areas, had fallen by another 30%. In other words, being a rural entrepreneur became much more profitable than being an urban wage earner, where the state was more interventionist. China's example is remarkable and illustrates the importance of allowing small entrepreneurs to grow a local shop into something as big as the next Alibaba. Think about it. Why did so many businesses emerge in a socialist country? I mean, what guarantees did Chinese companies have that the government, still led by the Communist Party, wouldn't revert to its old ways? Remember, there were no institutions guaranteeing a rule of law or, for that matter, a justice system free from corruption. But you know what? That wasn't necessary. Their neighboring country, Hong Kong, served those functions. It's well known that Hong Kong was a huge entry point for foreign capital into China. What's less known is that Chinese companies themselves moved there to grow. Want an example? Lenovo, the well-known laptop manufacturer that bought IBM's legendary manufacturing division. Despite the Chinese Communist Party once boasting that a Chinese company had acquired an important part of a major American company, the reality is that 100% ownership of Lenovo's Chinese operations was held by its Hong Kong division. But wait a second, the title of this video says, China's rural areas are poorer. How is it possible that all these companies began emerging there? The answer is that this disparity didn't start until the 1990s. In fact, rural areas were initially more promising. For many years, cities and urban areas remained closely tied to the old communist system. For instance, while rural companies had access to private credit, urban companies had to rely on state banks, which were, of course, much less efficient. But despite this, the number of entrepreneurs stopped growing. Chinese people dedicated less and less time to business activities, even though they were more profitable. Why? The reason is that there was a moment when everything changed, a moment when the government turned against its rural entrepreneurs and condemned them to poverty. This shift began with the famous Tiananmen protests. The gathering at Tiananmen Square didn't start as a protest, but as a tribute to Hu Yaobang, one of Deng Xiaoping's two key allies, who had recently passed away. The thing is, Yaobang advocated for both economic and political freedom, but was ultimately purged from the party. How did people react to this? With protests. This made the government realize it wasn't in their interest to have a strong entrepreneurial class completely outside their control. So, from that point on, a radical shift took place. The government stopped favoring small private rural businesses and began focusing on attracting foreign investment into large cities. And why foreign investment instead of local investment? Think about it. An investor from the US isn't going to take to the streets demanding more democracy or destabilizing your government. Of course, not everyone in the government agreed with this approach. Deng Xiaoping's right-hand man, Zhao Ziyang, supported a much more open model. What does the Communist Party do with dissenters? Exactly, Zhao Ziyang was purged. Yes, it's true that in the 90s, China privatized many companies representing over 40 million jobs. However, these privatizations were done following a motto: grasp the big, let go of the small. In other words, smaller companies were privatized. while the state maintained control, directly or indirectly, of the larger ones. For instance, a study analyzing 600 large companies in Shanghai showed that shares were divided in such a way that the state held a third, private companies and funds held another third, and individual investors held the remaining third. But guess what percentage of board seats the state had? It was 50%, far more than its share would suggest. Meanwhile, individual investors represented barely 0.3%, with the remaining seats often controlled by companies closely aligned with the government. This explains why, during the 1990s, the size of the Chinese state didn't decrease, but actually more than doubled. In just over a decade, the number of government employees more than doubled. The worst part is that the rural private sector's share of fixed asset investment shrank from 20% to just 6%. So how did the government sink the private sector? Primarily by restricting licenses and capital for starting businesses. For licenses, certain goods, like most fertilizers and grain, became controlled by local monopolies, and the state imposed stricter licensing and trade barriers. But the most crucial factor was the lack of capital. In the previous decade, credit had flowed freely in rural areas. Now, the faucet was shut off. Want an example? Take the township and village enterprises, rural businesses that had been incredibly profitable. But with credit now so scarce, they entered into the red and nearly disappeared by the decade's end. Meanwhile, public TVEs, though a minority, were granted more privileges than private ones, despite private TVEs often being 50% to 70% more profitable. To make matters worse, the government began cracking down on private lending, even between friends and family. The state also confiscated more land and significantly increased rural taxes. One study showed how taxes in one village jumped from 85 kilos of grain per unit of land to 215, over double. Public spending on rural infrastructure, health, and education was also cut back, resulting in 30 million more people becoming illiterate. But there's no better place to see the consequences of these policies than in the crown jewel, Shanghai. Shanghai, with its skyscrapers and highways, is one of those cities that fascinates so many Westerners. Today, it's one of the wealthiest places in China. However, as we've said, the initial reforms benefited rural areas the most, and so Shanghai's economic influence began to decline sharply. That all changed with Tiananmen. National policy once again focused on large cities, sidelining the countryside, and Shanghai's GDP skyrocketed compared to the rest of the country. Now, I know what you're thinking. Sure, the government abandoned rural areas, but this must have led to massive wealth for the urban classes. But that's not quite the case. Although Shanghai's urban per capita GDP was 5 times higher than the national average, household incomes in urban areas were only twice as high. In other words, the higher the GDP grew, the less income, relatively speaking, Shanghai residents had compared to the national average. Why was this? The answer is that Shanghai's workers received a tiny portion of the GDP, while the government and foreign companies took most of the pie. But here's the most surprising thing. Shanghai received 10 percentage points more in public transfer payments relative to GDP than other provinces. In other words, rural China was subsidizing the big cities with its taxes. Conclusion: everything we've covered is summed up in this graph. During the initial reforms, which benefited rural areas, the entire population improved at the same pace. However, after the political shift, post-Tiananmen, growth focused on the wealthiest, while the poorest lost income in absolute terms. This explains why, during this period, inequality in China grew twice as fast as in the previous decade, reaching levels similar to those in Latin America. And yes, China grew enormously and became much wealthier during this time. That's undeniable. But if rural China had maintained its growth rate from before this shift, it would be 50% wealthier today. And when compared to places like Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, or South Korea, China's economic growth has been much smaller. To be fair, since Hu Jintao's administration, this intense focus on foreign investment and urban areas has gradually eased. In fact, Xi Jinping's motto is common prosperity. And for some years now, the government has been subsidizing the countryside with revenue from the cities. Take, for example, the high-speed rail lines to provinces where there's barely enough population to make them profitable. But today, consumption in China remains suppressed. Wages are lower than they should be for their GDP level, and the remaining funds subsidize the manufacturing sector. This model is still partly in place, and it's important to understand that it wasn't the only path. Now it's your turn. Did you know these facts about the Chinese miracle? Do you think Tiananmen played such a crucial role, or were there other factors at play? How might China look today if it had continued with its initial reform model? Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to this channel and hit the bell to make sure you don't miss any updates. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and we'll see you in the next one.